This is Catchbox.
Okay.
So they're on. You just chuck it at them.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're very friendly. Are you guys
I think this is fine, right?
up to you if you want somebody to stand up and intro.
Yeah, let's just do that.
Okay. Oh, cool. Thank you. All right. Brilliant. Yes, good. Sounds good. So we have a. This is the.
Do you know how that works? Is it on all the time?
Hello.
Wow.
So Catchbox. I just think I will try and see if I can.
Yeah, if you can just
Messaging.
yeah.
Hi there. Hi. Kulthoum? Yeah. Hi. How are you? Yes. Oh, nice to meet you. Thank you. Joining us. So now making a presentation, right? No. I know you.
Good to see you again. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, very well.
I went to Berlin. Now we just need to how many people. How we get So Donna's. Oh yeah, got money. Yeah.
I was going to say, maybe this would be the most appropriate seat so that you can leave without breaking the pattern.
And Sven is here now.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Just try and get some people from the party. Yes. If you would sit here, then you can leave without breaking the panel. That's right. Hi. My class.
Weil ich habe
No, for bringing up research. Don't just ask her if you. Yeah, why don't you? Yeah. Secretariat is I'm on the, yeah.
I do think some people enjoy
But there's also still a question mark, including regarding about the, so you sit here.
No, I haven't accepted Monday this week.
No, it's 2. Otherwise, I don't think I would have made it.
So
Well, let's get you some. Thanks.
That looks like Sherry.
I think we should just, you never know. Wait forever on a Friday evening.
There's that thing on that little.
Welcome, everyone, all of you. We knew this was a tough slot for a side event. May I ask all of you, except those who are really sitting in the back, to be able to leave quickly, to just move to the front, because we can make this an interesting and relatively intimate conversation. So I'd say let's use the first 3 rows, but leave the rest of the room for what it is. Of what may not be the best attended, but certainly one of the most interesting side events of these 2 weeks. So thank you for joining. This is an event under the auspices of the A2R initiative, an initiative launched in Paris by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the previous Secretary General, who had been very forceful in putting the negotiations for the Paris Agreement, primarily among states, on a strong footing also with all the other actors that on the one hand were needed to generate the momentum to come to an ambitious agreement, but would also be so necessary to implement it. And in his initial climate summit in New York in 2014, he noted that there was an unbalance between the number of initiatives relating to greenhouse gas mitigation and a number of initiatives addressing resilience. And in his work in the United Nations and working with many of the partners, but especially the most vulnerable countries, he noted that that second pillar, what in the end became the second pillar of the Paris Agreement, was actually at least equally important. So he launched this initiative to try and spur action between all of those different types of stakeholders, private sector, civil society, governments, but not just at national level, certainly also at city and state level, to get to the same level of ambition on resilience as we have on climate mitigation. And he shaped that initiative with 3 pillars: anticipate, absorb, and reshape. That part of this is about seeing in advance what's coming our way and doing better in anticipating and addressing those hazards. To some extent also absorbing some of them. This relates to some of the discussions in the previous side event in this room on what is now called loss and damage in the convention. But clearly also relates to many of the mechanisms that we already have, including insurance, for instance, to deal with absorbing shocks. And finally, reshaping development so that we can try and avoid some of these risks that we have also created with developments over the past decades. How can we do better, and what are the incentives and instruments that all of these different parties can bring to the table and be more effective in working together? What you see here is a briefing paper that just came out with an overview of the status on these different trajectories. What we want to do tonight is not just review that briefing paper, but primarily have a discussion. And in that sense, it's good for a small group. We can really have a discussion, find out what that same ambition on multi-stakeholder action, but particularly increasing ambition also on the adaptation front, what that requires, how we're doing on that, but also how it relates to the discussions in the more formal negotiations here in the convention. I'm very pleased with the fantastic panel that we've lined up for you. For now, I'll just introduce our first speaker, who will have to leave very quickly for another commitment at 7 p.m. And that's Secretary Manny de Guzman, who is the Commissioner of the Philippines Climate Change Commission. It would take this whole side event to do justice to his credentials on climate change. But among other things, he's been very active in the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which was so instrumental in achieving the deal in Paris. And he will start with some opening remarks, giving his vision on this challenge of anticipating the changes that come, absorbing the shocks, and reshaping development. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good evening, esteemed colleagues. First of all, I would like to commend the organizers, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and the A2R initiative of former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for convening this important forum. The topic conveys myriad challenges to all stakeholders for climate action. Measuring the effectiveness of interventions for adaptation, much more for building resilience, although difficult, is not entirely impossible. To measure progress is to know first where we have been in terms of losses. For us, the Philippines has been sustaining average losses of 0.5% of its GDP every year from impacts of natural hazards and climate-influenced events. In 2013, when Typhoon Haiyan tragedy visited us, the Philippines sustained losses of about 4% of its GDP. In order to effectively measure progress in adaptation and eventually resilience, is to put in place a system of tracking and analyzing local and sectoral losses and the factors that caused them, as well as the effectiveness of our adaptation and mitigation initiatives, measured in the degree to which the losses are lessened. In support of this, the Philippines is establishing a national loss and damage registry that would standardize loss and damage valuation and reporting and would aid risk assessment and risk profiling at the local community level, as well as policy development in risk transfer and financing. Truth to tell, climate change magnifies prevailing disaster risks, but it also challenges us to reform and to take action. We are challenged to change the ways we think and the ways we do things. We are challenged also to do more and to do better. In short, we are challenged to rethink development. Developing countries like the Philippines are striving to implement innovative and more effective adaptation and resilience building measures because of intensified natural hazard challenges from climate change. While old approaches have naturally come about and worked, they unfortunately are less effective or are even ineffective in many instances, given the current realities and complexities of climate risk problem. However, there are strategies that enable us to draw up more effective adaptation and mitigation responses, and we find effective risk management as the key. It essentially entails understanding the dangers our communities face and being one step ahead by anticipating and lessening the detrimental impacts of natural hazards through disaster risk reduction measures like early warning, science-informed contingency planning, and re-engineering to adjust to changing realities. Today's challenge really means that we cannot settle for a hit-and-miss approach. A quantitative and probabilistic risk assessment affords us the opportunity to measure the possible intensity of the hazard, how such would affect or increase the vulnerability of the exposed, the people and their support systems, and allows us to systematically draw up realistic response measures to avoid or reduce the adverse impacts. The Philippines has taken on this challenge of adopting the probabilistic approach to risk assessment as a policy, and we are getting positive incremental results in risk management. We also have gone one step further by applying the multi-hazard approach for cost effectiveness. This advancement, however, entails a whole-of-government approach and extensive capacity building at the local government level. Climate change adaptation and mitigation and disaster risk reduction are a priority. Their integrated pursuit continues to be a strong force that compels climate action at the national and local levels. The Philippines has several landmark laws on climate change and environmental protection, and their implementation is a constant challenge. Foremost among them are the Climate Change Act of 2009 that created the Climate Change Commission and calls for the formulation of comprehensive adaptation and mitigation plans and strategies at both national and local levels. And the People's Survival Fund, our domestic climate finance that provides an annual appropriation of 1 billion pesos for funding climate change adaptation initiatives. We in the Climate Change Commission, as the lead policy-making agency for climate change, has led the implementation of the National Climate Action Plan in order to mainstream climate change initiatives at the local level, working with local government units and civil society organizations, especially the Philippine Red Cross and other key stakeholders. Capacitating our local officials and leaders, our first responders, has been our primary concern. We envision all of our local government units to develop and implement, pursuant to law, their own local climate change action plans, or what we call LCCAPs, that are responsive to their respective situation and needs in order to enhance community resilience and to protect, most especially the poor, against the effects of climate change. These local climate change action plans adopt a comprehensive and integrated risk management approach that specifies and articulates adaptation strategies and investments, including options for sustainable livelihood, fully aware of the climate outlook. Multi-stakeholder conversions are also crucial in our work. The Climate Change Commission facilitates the synergy of government and key stakeholders' actions in strengthening and understanding of climate and disaster risk, especially at the local government and community level, as in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. This is a priority of action. In this work, we engage our institutions of higher learning, the academicians and technical experts, to develop standard analytical tools and training modules, and to deliver training programs to local government authorities and staffs in risk science-based local development planning. This is an important endeavor right now in the Philippines, because out of 1,710 local government units that we have, we found out recently that only 167 local government units have local climate change action plans. Requirement of law. So now we really have to invest in capacity building, because always the reason of the local government units, they don't know how to do the fundamental analysis of risk or risk assessment. They don't know cost-benefit analysis. So how much more, identifying and prioritizing their adaptation interventions to the local risks. So we're investing in that. Now, moreover, acting based on heightened risks and reliable forecasts is something we are also strongly exploring now. As I earlier mentioned, risk management anchored on probabilistic risk assessment is an innovation that would enable countries to systematically address future impacts before they happen. For residual risks, this can be effectively managed through appropriate risk transfer or risk-sharing mechanisms that actually take into consideration the non-bankability risk of the most vulnerable through weather-based index insurance and other appropriate alternative livelihoods that enable the poor to recover quickly after disaster or calamity. There are continuing discussions with our National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, our National Meteorological Office, or PAGASA, and our Social Welfare Department, and the Department of Finance on the viability of releasing response money based on agreed thresholds and do actions in advance. Through forecast-based financing, we will be able to use our resources in a timelier manner, especially during extreme and slow onset events. As you may be aware, the Philippines served Climate Vulnerable Forum, or CVF, in the run-up to and during COP21. In this role, we underscored the critical threshold of 1.5 degrees as a matter of survival and as an opportunity to thrive. Our campaign to enshrine this goal in the Paris Agreement proved a success, and now the world is committed to striving towards this goal. Our members have been demonstrating leadership towards achieving that ambitious target, such as by adopting a 100% renewable energy objective during the Marrakesh last year. Philippines also launched the V20 group of ministers of finance of the CVF, and that body is now working very actively to promote innovative measures and public finance responses to support ambitious climate action. Without 1.5 degrees and without the means, our efforts to implement transformational activities in reducing disaster and climate risk are limited. In this regard, let me invite you to support the transformational leadership of the CVF and take part in our advocacy initiatives towards our enhanced climate actions and collective achievement of the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. In scaling up our efforts, mainstreaming climate change adaptation and mitigation, disaster risk reduction, and ecosystems management and restoration in our development planning processes certainly helps us to scale up efforts for adaptation and resilience goals. We can achieve these goals by delivering our commitments under the UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol, and now the Paris Agreement, especially on the provision of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for developing country parties. With coherent risk management approaches, we will be able to ensure that our programs are climate smart and ecosystems based. We should stop treating these in silos. Disaster and development need to be looked at in a continuum and through different time scales. This is what we have been strongly advocating for in the Philippines. Finally, in all these efforts, multi-stakeholder convergence that facilitates capacity building in all levels, especially at the local community level, is crucial for strengthening local development and adaptation planning and accessing climate finance that provides opportunity for scale-up models that work and for delivering benefits to the climate vulnerable. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you at this opening of this important forum. Mabuhay.
Thank you very much for sharing that experience, sharing with us how you've had this leadership, this vision enshrined in national laws and planning a long time ago. So we're not looking at countries just starting on this journey. We're actually looking at an experience going back a long time, but still also sharing the challenges and actually implementing that and taking it forward, including doing that at the local level where so many of these decisions and planning processes need to take place, and the challenge of building the capacity for that in taking things to scale. Extremely relevant as we start this discussion here. I'm aware you will need to go soon.
Yes.
So let me give the audience a chance to ask any questions before you leave. And there's a beautiful, I don't know, for those of you who've not attended side events before, there's a beautiful box here that allows you to speak up. Any questions? If not, I might have one. Comparing yourself with that long track record to some of the other countries in the Climate Vulnerable Forum, some of whom are at a lesser stage of history, thinking about these issues and addressing them. What advice would you have to speed up the development and to scale up based on the experience in the Philippines? What are the essential ingredients, you would say, that can make us go faster? And maybe two things in that. What are the things that you need to do in your own countries at national and local level, but also where can the global system facilitate that?
Okay, well, I've mentioned about convergence and multi-stakeholder cooperation. I think this is very important. In the CVF, in fact, as a community of nations, collectively advocating for enhanced action by all nations so that we can really achieve the goal of 1.5 of the Paris Agreement. We are actually investing in exchange of knowledge and know-how. And we are establishing in the Philippines what we call a South-South Cooperation Collaboration Center, where we can really promote, exchange of information, exchange of knowledge, and facilitate, knowledge and technology development transfer. And we will also promote training. Locally, a big challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is that we really have to sensitize local authorities. And since local authorities and also technical staff, periodically change, because when there's a new administration or like there's a new mayor, some of the technical staff go along with him. So we lose the trained ones, those who really know, in whom we have invested some training. So there has to be continuous training. So in this regard, since like the Sendai framework calls for a revision of all national and local plans by 2020, that's the first deadline to be met. And we have to align all our plans with the global targets, as well as with the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a big challenge at the national and local level. So how do we do this? It's important that we really invest in capacity building, training at the local level, come up with how to come up with risk sensitive and science-based local development plans. And as I also articulated, very fundamental is the ability to do risk assessment. Because in risk assessment, you're able to identify your local risk, come up with a risk profile at the local level. And then knowing your risk problem, that's the start. That's the start. No? Because you identify your strategies, your interventions, or mitigation interventions. And then if you know how to do cost-benefit analysis, very few at the local level would know how to do cost-benefit analysis, then how would you be able to prioritize, given you have limited resources? All the identified measures, you don't have the resources to implement all those measures. So now our problem, we have institutionalized what we call a domestic climate finance, People Survival Fund, 1 billion every year. Government allocates money there. But our experience, it's very difficult to access. Out of 1,710 LGUs, we have only 2 were able to access last year. Why? There are many proposals, but they're not all good proposals. Of course, you cannot just give away this money. There should be, you should, prudently, distribute this based on sound proposal. No, so we need to teach the stakeholders how to come up with good proposals to be able to access this domestic climate finance. Now, in a bigger scale, there's Green Climate Fund. Okay, that's why there's a readiness program for the country. We really have to capacitate also governments, especially national, the national focal agencies for accessing this climate finance and come up with really good proposals. And that would entail multi-stakeholder consultation. So that's a whole of government approach to proposing solutions that can be funded by international climate finance. So these are just a few of the many challenges that we confront right now in the Philippines from our perspective. And maybe it's the same with other countries, other developing countries. So we really need to invest on capacity building, skills development, readiness to access climate finance.
Thank you so much. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I want to use the opportunity. Just a few weeks ago, the V20 finance ministers met for the first time in a more formal setting with the G20. And I would like to know whether you have specific expectations or suggestions what the G20, which will meet in a few weeks and are meeting on a working level, what they can do to, let's say, respond to some of the requests or some of the challenges you've identified for the cooperation with the vulnerable countries like Philippines, but overall the G20. So are there specific things you think the G20 can do in that regard?
Well, we have to look at it, of course, also in the perspective of the developing countries. Right now, I know many countries are undertaking revisiting of their NDCs, no? And of course, the NDCs will define the actions they will have to undertake in the next years, and it will also define where investment will come in, and how climate finance could also support these investments, either for adaptation or mitigation. And the big challenge really now is to align our NDCs to the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. No? It is futile if we keep the business as usual, when existing policies, existing plans bring us to a 3.73 world. So there's a really big challenge for us to revisit our commitments and enhance our action, and see how those who can help developing countries be able to pursue actions, consistent with 1.5, could be made known and made clear, perhaps through climate finance. So, well, this is just some initial thoughts, because we live in one world. I mean, we just have to, work together. This is no longer time for, blaming anyone. We breathe one air. So it's real. The challenge really is collective action. See how we can live together and help each other, thread onwards the path of a resilient future.
That was a beautiful final statement. I think you are ready to go.
Okay.
But thank you so much for sharing that vision. I know you're late. So thank you so much for both your initial remarks, but also the additional responses. I think it puts us on a great footing for the rest of the discussion. I look forward to seeing you here over the rest of the week. But thank you for being with us for now, and good luck the rest of your meetings tonight.
Thank you. By the way, Donna is around. I thank Donna for inviting me here also. But Donna is around if you have more questions about the Philippines.
So those final remarks also remind us how the discussions on ambition on adaptation that we're having here tonight don't exist in a vacuum and are taking place against a background of rapid climate change already happening and scenarios potentially upon us for the coming decades. At the same time, the really concrete nature of some of the development planning challenges that brings, including the capacity constraints often felt at the local level. And I think we need to have very pragmatic solutions that indeed bring these actors together and give them something very concrete to do, rather than the often quite abstract discussions that we tend to have in these hallways. So without further ado, I think I'll just introduce the panel as we go through, if you don't mind. My name is Maarten van Aalst. I'm director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. The International Federation of the Red Cross is one of the partners in this multi-stakeholder initiative. It's my honor to facilitate the discussion, which I would really like to be a discussion. So please shout for that blue box if you have anything to add or any question to ask. Let's make this quite interactive. My first question will go to Anne Olhoff, who's with the UNEP DTU partnership in Copenhagen. And hearing those challenges just now from the Philippines, the realities also of these big global problems and then these very constrained local capacities. What we are asked to assess, and I know many of the discussions are about the facilitative dialogue next year and the global stocktake in 2023. How do we assess global progress on adaptation if we define adaptation as enhancing adaptive capacities, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal referred to in Article 2? So how do we address these very real challenges in the Philippines, measure our collective progress, and make sure that in the end we get done what needs to get done from the global to the very practical local government level? Can you share some insights on how you think we should measure our progress?
Thanks, Maarten. Yeah, that's a very easy question and a good illustration of the crystal clear formulation in the Paris Agreement. It's actually how we measure progress on adaptation at the global level is actually one of the that we've been trying to address in one of the pieces of work that I'm involved in with the UN Environment, which is on adaptation gaps. And the first report that we did on this came out in 2014, so 1 year before the Paris Agreement, and it basically made the argument that adopting a global goal on adaptation, we had hoped for something slightly more clear-cut with a clearer description of goal and maybe even targets. But that would be a huge step forward in terms of providing a strategic framework for adaptation that could really facilitate a common understanding of what we need to do and how we can also assess progress, but also in terms of directing action to become more efficient and effective. So it's a great step forward. I think that we do have a global goal on adaptation. It's, of course, still very open. So a key question that I think we need to address is how we can put it into practice in a way that makes sense, given the constraints also of the negotiations and the discussions over here, and the enormous challenge of basically starting with the huge complex situation at the very local level, at the national level, and going up to global level. So I think it's important that we move towards defining it more clearly, because that basically will have a huge implication for how effective and focused we can become in actually achieving an impact or in the negotiations and at the global level. But I would like to highlight in terms of how do we measure progress more, how can we go about it? I think the three key areas and entry points that we can use and that would facilitate moving towards something that makes sense at the global level. And the first relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you read so beautifully, one of the beautiful aspects of this is that actually the global goals under the Paris Agreement are referring directly to and in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a clear link there. And also about vulnerability, and about capacity and about resilience are really intrinsically linked to development. So in many ways, if we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we will also have come a long way in terms of reducing vulnerability, increasing capacities, and building resilience. So that's a good entry point. And I think I guess my key point is we don't need to build up huge new processes. We can actually use what is already there. We can build on that and expand on that. So obviously we could develop based on the indicators and on the goals we already have under the Sustainable Development Agenda. We could tweak some of those to make more sense and to make sure that we include key aspects related to adaptation. So that was the first point. And I think the link between the SDGs and the adaptation goal is also very clear when we look at the nationally determined contributions that countries have developed and submitted, where you can see a huge overlap between the sector priorities that countries have put forward and the SDGs. So that's another sort of points to the overlap. At the same time, we also see from the NDCs that there's a huge need for additional support to countries in further specifying the adaptation components and indicators and methodologies. And that's also what's coming out of the discussion, especially under the Adaptation Committee right now. So that's a main task in order to also make progress at the global level. And then thirdly and lastly, in terms of good entry points, there are so many other sources of information that we can draw on and so many other activities and initiatives ongoing. So de Guzman mentioned the Sendai framework. That provides a lot of good indicators that are clearly very relevant to adaptation and to anticipating, absorbing and reshaping also development. We have the WHO in the area of health, who are already working a lot on climate change related issues and have developed very good indicators and metrics for tracking this and so forth. So there are many good entry points that we can use. And I think basically it will be a lot easier to track progress globally because we're moving towards the tip of the iceberg of all the relevant information. And it's just about the key issue is really how we can condense and how we can aggregate from the local to the global level in terms of what is relevant at the different levels. So in that sense, if we can agree on what are the key aspects and dimensions we want to track globally, then it's pretty easy compared to the challenges faced at the national and local level.
Okay, that's an optimistic perspective, but recognizing those real challenges at the national and local level. So let's go straight to that. Kulthoum Omari, you're with the Africa Adaptation Initiative. I guess part of the reason you've banded together in Africa is that you're facing some of the most difficult issues in this field as well. And I'm sure you've been wrestling with these questions as well. What should be the ask here in the UNFCCC, and how does it relate to the real realities on the ground at local level, but also the national planning that needs to go along with that in the countries in Africa? How do you look at these questions of establishing the right priorities and then measuring our progress, both locally, nationally, and especially globally?
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Maybe before I even answer that, because I have an answer, is just to give you a bit of background around this adaptation initiative, the Africa Adaptation Initiative. So that Africa Adaptation Initiative came from the realization from our heads of states, African heads of state, that indeed there is this adaptation gap and there is the finance gap that we need to address. And that was actually informed by what you talked about earlier, is the adaptation gap report, the Africa Adaptation Gap Report, which was able to quantify to some extent. I mean, we know we have to get our methodologies. There's still a little bit more work around methodologies in terms of what the cost of adaptation is, but it was quantified from the Africa Adaptation Gap Report that Africa will need between 7 to 15 billion a year by 2020 to adapt, and then that cost will obviously go up with warmer scenarios, climate scenarios. So, so realizing that as a gap in terms of adaptation and adaptation finance, the African heads of state initiated this Africa Adaptation Initiative in order to address those gaps. So it was launched at COP, and I think also at that time, that's when also we were talking about the pre-2020 ambition. Yes, on the one hand, we are going to talk about adaptation in the context of the negotiations for a very long time. We've been talking about this for a very long time, but we really need urgent action. So this was born from that urgency, that sense of urgency that needed to happen, but within the context of the pre-2020 discussion. So really born from the needs of the African countries. And it was launched, and last year, I'm happy to say that in December, we were able to launch the framework on what exactly this initiative will do. Of course, identifying the needs of African countries, that's the first step, because this initiative was created in order to meet the needs, and the needs are defined by the priorities of the countries. This time, the initiative was designed from the bottom up. How that was done was at the time that the initiative was developed, that was just after we had to submit our INDCs at that time. And we went through a process where we were able to assess a common thread within the adaptation component of the INDCs. And we were able to identify at least 4 elements that are common to all the African countries. In fact, 53 countries in Africa submitted an adaptation component of the INDCs, so only 1 country didn't. And out of that, we're able to see that the common elements that are the needs of the African countries is climate information services. The second element is around climate finance. So how do we increase access to climate finance, not only at the local level, but also at national level to development and national adaptation plans and implementing adaptation action. And the third one was around adaptation policies. So development of adaptation policies, because we know that adaptation and climate change in more general is dealt with in a very siloed approach, so that was identified as a gap. So these 3 areas, we identify them to, this is going to be the focus of the initiative that we are going to try and work through up until 2020. So we have a work plan up until 2020. How do we see this linked to measuring progress? We think that's really important. One, we also have to report to our heads of state how much we've done, from since the initiative was launched. But also, we think that the Africa Adaptation Initiative provides that space, because we have access, we have a mandate from the African states. So we have a mandate, we have access to countries where we are able to distill what those needs are. And because we're able to do that, we initiated a process where we will do an annual state of adaptation report, which identifies needs not from consultants. We go straight to the focal points, because they're members, straight to focal points and identify what the needs are of the countries, what are the existing initiatives, and therefore what are the gaps. And this tool, we call it an advocacy tool in the end, because it's supposed to inform us as we go into the negotiations. Exactly, we keep talking about what are these needs, what are these needs. So from the region of Africa, we think that through this process, we'll be able to articulate exactly what the needs are, what are the gaps in implementation, and therefore how can that process feed back into the convention so that we're able to advocate for more resources, for more action. It's the same things that we're talking about when we go into the negotiations. So we think this process is not divorced from the negotiations. It will assist us, not just as Africa, but as is a multilateral process. We negotiate, we engage, we work with partners. And so using that process of developing this state of adaptation report, we think that will track progress, track the challenges, track how we're doing with adaptation. I think I'll stop here. And
thank you very much. Just one clarifying question: how does these ambitions, as expressed in the adaptation initiative for the whole continent, how do they relate to the national adaptation plans that individual countries are developing?
So the needs that we have identified and included in the AAI. Well, as you know, in Africa, if I think only 2 countries have developed their national adaptation plans so far. So we still have a real challenge in that sense. And that's why we think also we could, as the Africa Adaptation Initiative, facilitate a process where we are able to facilitate countries so that they can access the 3 million that has come from the GCF in order to work with partners. Of course, there are many partners on the continent, UNDP, UNEP, and I think GIZ and some other partners that are already doing this work on the ground. So facilitate a process where countries are able to access this money and develop their national adaptation plans, because as I said, only 2 countries have done that. But I have to say, I mean, you know that we had to develop the INDCs within, some countries had to do it within a very, very, very short time. So you will see that in terms of the quantity and the quality in each INDC varies quite significantly. I know in my country where I come from, Botswana, there's about 3 pages on the adaptation component of the INDC. So those were not clearly articulated. So I'm really quite happy that we're getting into the stage where we're actually now talking about these national communications. The adaptation communications, which we are going to talk about in the APA, where we are clear around what information is needed, vulnerabilities, how do we go to a stage where we're going to measure the vulnerabilities, information around cost. So this minimum information that we're having in the negotiations is very important because of the wide variety of quality that we have in our existing INDCs, and it's the information that we have so far, it's not enough. So we need to have more kind of guidance on how we can all develop these adaptation components of INDCs so that we are able to have a clear sense and a clear picture of what the needs are in the continent.
Thank you so much. Again, the challenges are clear, and it's good to see you coming together to address some of them. It's also clear that there's still a lot of work to do, and it's good to see the efforts complementing each other and the needs, at least to some extent, being addressed. Sven Harmeling, we already heard a bit from you. Sven is Global Advocacy Coordinator on Climate for CARE International. You've been following the global climate discussions for a long time, but you're also part of a network that primarily delivers at the local level in individual communities, primarily with a long-term sustainable development agenda. I know you're part of some of the major networks bringing together these local efforts, Partners for Resilience. You've got several programs in Embraced, one of these primarily development-oriented efforts to address rising risks related to climate and extremes. How would you suggest we measure progress, and how do you see the sort of suggestions Anne was making, using some of the existing frameworks, including the SDGs, also to feed the discussions we're having here, specifically related to climate?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation. And maybe before I go into some of the aspects around the local level implementation, maybe connecting to what has been said before, I think we have a very important momentum at the moment. On the one hand, with the NDCs and the whole attention around the Paris Agreement. I mean, when the whole debate about the NDCs started, it was a pure mitigation debate, and many countries either didn't want to have the adaptation into it or were concerned what would it mean, how complicated it would be. But then what we've seen is that basically, I think all developing countries put adaptation components into their NDC. And many also with a strategic objective to that this could help build the profile of adaptation as a key issue, both in the global debate, but also nationally. And I think that's a very important development, because overall we see a lot of attention to the NDCs, and the fact that adaptation in there then also spills over for attention into adaptation. I think the link to the Sustainable Development Goals is extremely important. I think also we see in many countries a lot of momentum around the SDGs. I've been doing some work over the last weeks on reviewing the national reports to the SDG process, and from a climate change perspective, but also beyond that, you realize there's a lot of revision going on, looking at the country's legislations, looking at indicator frameworks in terms of identifying the way forward. what we see there is partially that the global SDG indicator framework, I mean, on the one hand, it's not climate proof at all. There are some entry points, but you need to do more work on the national level to climate proof it, but also that countries also identify additional indicators which they find even more suitable for their own work in terms of the way forward. And if we manage to strongly connect this momentum in the national level with the need to build resilience and adaptation to climate change impacts, and also to sensitize about the many linkages between climate change impacts and many of the SDGs, I think that's a very important opportunity. There are some countries who are starting to really bring the indicator frameworks together. I've looked a bit into the Philippines, and you probably can tell much more about it. But there's the attempt, at least in the beginning, to use the SDGs as a framework for the national adaptation plan process and the M&D of this. So I think there's a lot of more awareness and work going on to harness some of the synergies that are out there. The other point, I think you started off with the global adaptation goal. I think it's a very important one, and this is an opportunity which we need to use much more. It's coming up here in negotiations on the adaptation communication in particular, but there is no space at the moment to really think through how can we really make use of this joint vision and joint direction and build something up which helps us to some extent at least aggregate the progress, and we've started to discuss this here. So I think that's an area where much more needs to happen on the UNFCCC level as well. There are some elements in the agenda for the next years. For example, the adaptation committee is next year going to host a workshop around indicators that countries are using on the national level, and particularly linking SDGs and adaptation. And I think these some other elements are there. So there's more work needed to build up the underlying process for the global adaptation goal, feed into the global stocktake, etc. And then there's the whole level, of course, of implementation. And we as CARE, we also have our challenges. We've made some progress over the last 2 years to try to identify joint indicators, resilience indicators, which we try to increasingly use in programs, and then understand what the progress is. We've done some work around trying to evaluate the sustainable development benefits of adaptation programs. There was some case study work in Niger, which also showed that over a certain time you can really generate multiple socioeconomic development benefits. And I think all of such work can also help us to understand what works and what doesn't work. And also from all the other adaptation work that's happening, just another example, and then I also stop. For example, the Adaptation Fund is one instrument which is implementing a lot of adaptation projects, some maybe better than others. But I think there's much more, for example, to gain out of the implementation, evaluation reports from these institutions, what works, what measurements also work, and which doesn't. And so I think we still need to find even better ways to bring together this knowledge, and in particular the measured experience from the practical implementation. So I stop there and look forward to the further conversation. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Also identifying the opportunities, also highlighting the need for feeding the global opportunities at the policy level with further discussions, linking all those different elements that you outlined before. And there is a lot cooking, there's a lot happening in these different processes, also in the knowledge sphere. I mentioned BRACE before, there's going to be a lot of evidence coming out the coming year. I think it's important, to the extent we're a community, between those in the room, that we keep those conversations going and link the different perspectives on these topics in these different fora. So I think it's important that you highlighted the Adaptation Committee. There's a technical expert meeting on adaptation the coming week as well that some of you might be interested in. I know it's also on the agenda from a local perspective at the Community-Based Adaptation Conference that's happening in Kampala next month. It will be a topic at the Development and Climate Days in the middle weekend of the next COP. So I'm sure these will be continued conversations, and I'd encourage everyone to feed that with all the different perspectives, because one thing is bringing it all together. And from that perspective of bringing it all together, and also hearing the different speakers, including Secretary de Guzman already referred to the need to bring all the different stakeholders together, I'm very pleased that we have with us tonight someone from a private sector perspective. So Samantha Harris comes from BSR, Business Social Responsibility, a private company working with business, historically on various areas of social responsibility, a strong track record on climate, but originally primarily on the climate change mitigation side, increasingly also seeing an interest to work on resilience. So from your perspective, also hearing many of these definitions that I think you probably wouldn't want to sell to a CEO of a major company, what brings them to this table? And what do you think, on the one hand, all of these discussions have to bring to them? What is it that's to connect? But also, what can they bring to this agenda?
Yeah, so thank you so much. So as Maarten was saying, BSR is a global nonprofit that works with companies on various sustainability issues, especially on climate. And I guess over the last couple of years, many of you may have noticed prior to Paris and the run-up to Paris, there's been a flurry of action of climate, or flurry of climate action from the private sector that includes actually a movement on corporate climate risk, which is really great because companies are really starting to get it and starting to hear more than just climate mitigation, but also just that it's a material risk to their business. And the WEF, the World Economic Forum, came out the last couple of years. It was in 2015, it was the #1 risk of those that they surveyed. So business actually said that climate was their #1 priority. I think it was #2 in 2016, below economy, but that's still pretty good considering where it had been in the previous years, which was pretty low. And there's been a number of other large, so Mark Carney from the Bank of England came out in 2015 saying that identifying climate as a #1 priority as well. And just that it was the amount of money that was we were subject to lose from the events of climate and that business would face this climate risk was just astronomical. So coming from that climate is a material risk to business, it's a material risk to their operations, their supply chains, their entire value chain, the communities that they work in, some of which are very vulnerable. And some of these risks are from their operations, so operational risks. So just from the inputs that they receive to do their business, whether you're a food, beverage, and agriculture company and you're getting agriculture inputs from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, if those areas, which some of which are very vulnerable to climate change, if those areas are not producing the inputs that you need to do your job, or to do what your company does, then you just can't operate. Logistically, so transportation, there are lots of different extreme weather events that are starting to disrupt the logistics and transportation around the world. Companies are definitely feeling that. There are a bunch of other risks, financial risks, the assets of certain technologies that are no longer going to be usable or valuable down the road. Human resources risks, reputational risks. So the risk of not acting on climate because many other companies or many other companies are starting to work on it. If you're not looking at it, your peers are doing stuff on climate. That's a big risk. And then also the compliance and legal risk of the Paris Agreement and the national determined contributions that come out of that. So and wherever your company operates. So many companies they're global, so they have different locations and they face different risks or different regulatory risks in each of those locations. So not complying to those is definitely something that companies are starting to face. Some of the research that we've done, so it's through a partnership with IDRC over the last couple of years, is looking at how we can bring this awareness to companies and how we can actually help them become to assess their risks across their value chain. But what we're finding is that companies aren't doing enough to prevent and deal with the climate risk. And it's mostly that they just don't understand it. They don't understand. They do regular risk assessments all the time. They're very good at risk. They're very good at assessing the risks that they think, are I mean, they're traditional risks, though. They're input risks, they're strategic risks, they're operational, and they're often not looking at climate. So if they are looking at climate, it's over in its own category over here as climate. But what we're looking to help companies with is to take those those risks that they're already doing and put a climate lens on them. So because climate really does, it just spans all of the risks that I just mentioned, so strategic. So we're looking at that. And I think not only are they not really aware of climate risk, but if they are aware of it, they're looking at it from a physical hazard standpoint. So they know that there are extreme weather events. They know that at some point there's sea level rise. They then tend to look at just their own infrastructure. So they look at their buildings, they look at where they operate, but maybe not their suppliers. And they look at how that might be exposed to an extreme weather event or sea level rise, but they don't really look at how vulnerable their operations are. And I think that's the key to what we're trying to get across to companies is that, so yeah, you know you have a physical hazardous event coming, but do you actually know how vulnerable your operations are? Do you know how vulnerable your suppliers are? Have you even looked at, have you done a risk assessment for your suppliers on climate change? Have you looked at your communities that you work in and your employees that work in that live in those communities? So you may have looked at your factory and how your factory may respond to a hazardous event like flooding or saltwater intrusion. But have you at all looked around at the community that you work in, and have you helped the people that work in that community? If not, then you may not have your workers at your door to do the work. So we're looking at it much on a vulnerability basis and also geographically. I mean, I need to add that we work with multinationals mostly, but we work across sectors. But every sector is so different. So a financial services sector is going to have completely different risks than a food, beverage, and agriculture company like Coca-Cola, for example. So it really is important that we do look at each sector, and we do look at how the sectors are affected differently from climate change. And also geographically, I mean, geographically, a food, beverage, and agriculture company is going to be completely different than one. North American companies are going to be different than, the effects are going to be different than one in Africa, for instance. So it is different across the sectors and geographies. And I think what we've helped companies do is we've helped to develop a capital assets framework. So looking at something that business understands. They understand capital assets, they understand risk. So we've tried to keep it in the language of business. And capital assets being that they can take physical assets, they can take natural assets, financial assets, and then deploy those against the risk that they're facing. So for example, physical assets could be building a flood barrier, for instance, and financial access could be providing, financial capital assets could be providing financial access to those in the community that face certain climate events. So we've developed this capital assets model to help companies build their resilience. So not only in their operations, but throughout their supply chain and communities that they work in. And I could probably talk about this forever, but maybe I'll stop there. Well, actually, maybe I'll just add one thing. I think the most important thing, so what makes businesses interested and what would bring them to the table to work on resilience? I mean, first is just that the business case is so important. You do have to show them the business case. Philanthropic is, some companies do have great philanthropic and corporate social responsibility programs, but to get them to really act on things, you do have to show them the business case, which is what we're trying to do. So, and then I think sitting at the table, so collaboration is key for businesses. They don't always know the best routes to do that, but sitting at the table with governments to talk through some of the policies that could help accelerate their action on resilience, could help make it more of a community aspect as opposed to just the business acting or vice versa. That's really important to them. They like to have a say in policies and policy making, as I'm sure you would imagine. So bringing them to the table with governments is really important. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there and then see if questions.
Let me first give the audience the opportunity. I immediately have one, but let's hear if anyone wants to come in and that we've heard from all of the speakers. If not, then let me kick it off. So how do we measure what all these companies will be doing over the coming years in order to track our global progress on adaptation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's much easier to measure the mitigation side from the company perspective as well. I mean, I think that's just generally how it goes. It's easy for companies to measure their emissions and then over the years measure how many emissions they've reduced. But adaptation is a little bit more difficult, and we've tried to think this through a little bit. It's not set in stone, but some of the ways that we've tried to help companies when they're building their resilience strategies, and then when they come back to assess their strategy a couple years later, is to look at maybe if they're implementing training programs on climate for their workers, for instance, to look at how many people they've trained, to look at what the number was before, on sort of those kinds of statistics and what they've done, and then also the amount of some companies can decide they'll make maybe big lofty resilience goals, and much in the same way that they make science-based target goals, and one of those goals is to invest in their supply chain to make it more sustainable. I mean, that's very vague, right? So one of the ways that they'll do that is to invest a certain amount of money in certain products, or either certain products or certain raw materials. So for instance, General Mills, we worked with them to design a strategy that looked at their top 10 ingredients, and then they decided to invest a certain amount for each ingredient over the coming years to make it more sustainable. So it could be a money figure, it could be some of the what I was saying earlier, the statistics on either trainings or financial, if they're providing financial access to some of their employees or some of the community. But I'd be happy to hear if anyone else has anything to add on how businesses might be able to track something in resilience, as it's just not so straightforward.
Any immediate suggestions?
I have one.
Please.
Maybe not so much as a suggestion, but I think one way forward, and one thing that still needs to be developed a lot, is one of the things that's gained a lot of traction here under the convention is the non-state actor and non-state action, really. And it's primarily been focused on city level and very much on mitigation, or what you might call green growth aspects. But the resilience and the private sector involvement in resilience is not yet very well developed. And I think that's really one vehicle for advancing on this. Also, I actually had a question, if I'm allowed. Sure. Because are you primarily looking at large and multinational, international companies? Because it's very different if you look at SMEs or what you're looking at.
Yeah, I've actually meant to say that in the very beginning. Sorry about that. But we work with mostly multinationals and global corporations. So oftentimes we'll work a little bit with SMEs through supply chains, but it's mostly the large corporations. So it is very different.
Although I should say that I think some of the principles you outlined, especially the focus on risk and the business case for better managing risk, applies across all scales. So the International Federation of the Red Cross, for instance, has launched a 1 billion coalition, which aims to reach 1 billion people to increase their resilience. And one of the entry points that the American Red Cross in particular has been working on is a business continuity initiative, which really just looks at small and medium enterprises and asks them questions about what do you do if a particular shock occurs? Noting that if those businesses go broke, then people also lose their jobs, for instance, whereas if they continue to function, that's actually fabric of society, it's economic continuity. It often also helps on a number of physical fronts. And it applies to the smallest, most vulnerable businesses in the most remote rural communities. And I'm sure the same principles would apply globally. This particular initiative was started in the United States, has been exported to a few countries, but not everywhere. How do you look at it in the Africa Adaptation Initiative? Do you have a private sector component of your plans?
No, we don't. That's the I suppose, the appropriate answer, because the needs of the need was defined by the countries, as I said, but then that if we went through all the INDCs, that element wasn't common amongst all the countries. So I know that with some countries it's important, especially when you look at issues around infrastructure, for example, how they can get involved in infrastructure and how they can get involved in addressing issues around, including insurance. But it wasn't something that came across all the countries, which is why we haven't made it as a core theme of the initiative. However, the next phase of the initiative will now go and define. We'll go into more details around maybe a regional approach. So, for example, if we identified countries within Southern Africa that see the need of, I don't know, infrastructure, for example, I'm giving an example. This is something that we take up, work with existing partners, and then work with through the GCF, because we also have a mandate to increase access through the GCF, the Green Climate Fund. So yeah, it's not something that's there. It's a conversation to be had. Particularly as we see that the role of the private sector is increasingly becoming visible, and we see how. But I think as we deal with private sector for the Africa group, it's really important that certain principles are respected. So issues around country-drivenness, who defines the problem, who defines the need, is very important. How do they meet the needs of the vulnerable communities? So those elements, those principles are still very, very, very strong in the way we engage. And I think even as we go to develop actions at country level, those principles would need to be respected, but certainly a need for private sector. I just wanted to say something as well. Some innovative projects within the, and I wanted to share this experience, this project of Sunby in Southern Africa. There is in order of increasing access to finance and addressing adaptation, there is a project that Sunby, Southern African Biodiversity Institute, that's based in South Africa, initiated, and it's not innovative in the sense that it has been done before, but it's done differently this time. So they've created a small grants facility, right? We know that UNDP has been doing that for quite a long time, but this initiative that is done through Southern African Biodiversity Institute is different in the sense that, one, they give 100. I think the range that they give. So there was a need, because small grants facility, they give a small amount of money. So I think it's within the region of under 50 million, 50, I think it's 50. This one is 100,000. So from a region of 100,000. And what they did is tried, because part of the challenge is when the countries went to the community to consult on what kind of projects can you develop and how can we access the GCF in order to address adaptation, the kinds of responses from the community was, okay, but the government is going to get all this money. How do we access it? So they worked with the GCF to develop mechanisms such that the communities are able to access funding. So the requirements, the application process made much simpler. And I think as we stand, about 8 communities have been able to access funds from the GCF through this mechanism, that small grants facility that is based at Sunby. And I'm raising this as an example of, one, how innovative ways in Africa have increased access to finance, because, as you know, for you to even track progress, you need to be able to find finance to support implementation of action. So this is some of things that we as Africa Adaptation Initiative could look at and see how we can scale up in other countries. Okay.
Maarten, we had a question.
Yes, please. And thank you for sharing that example, again, emphasizing the linking of scales and finding the right mechanisms to where they have the biggest impact. Thank you.
Yeah, mine is a combination of a question and a comment.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Peter Witt. I'm based with CARE Denmark, so a colleague with Sven. My observation is that the discussion we are having here on measuring progress is actually somehow linked to the negotiations we have going on during this week on how should you shape the so-called adaptation communications to inform the global stocktake, to inform the measuring of the progress on the global goal on adaptation. And then you cited from the Paris Convention and ask Anna this key question. And my question is, how do you see that the tools we have right now enables us to actually meet those expectations? I've been involved with this civil society project, because our partners are really interested in this adaptation communication, looking at it from a civil society perspective and thinking what do we want as civil society that the adaptation communication should cover. But these are not kind of the hardcore measuring progress stuff. It is rather that we would like the adaptation communication to reflect the reality on the ground, reflect the vulnerabilities of local communities, should inform whether adaptation planning is happening in a multi-stakeholder, participatory, involving way, whether funding is made available in a transparent way so it's accessible also for local communities. All these kind of things which are more or less generic expectations of civil society. And of course, it's difficult to see exactly how you could, in adaptation communications, and add it together, because I think the challenge is, since we don't have any sort of very strong indicators, how should the UNFCCC or whoever are put in charge of this add together what each country is submitting? And I think the main purpose is to get a kind of overview which would be able to inform this. I took a look at the SDG indicators for the climate goal. I'm not very impressed. It's very much about disaster risk. I don't see kind of adaptive capacity, vulnerability assessment included at all. It's the only community level element there is how many communities have disaster risk reduction plans, as the main focus is on sudden onset disasters and sort of the slow onset challenges of climate patterns changing, the crops you can grow are changing, is not covered. So there's a lot of work to do in order to find ways of sort of adding together. And a number of the submissions from different country parties actually have some interesting stuff. The African submission, something about measuring how many people are based in sectors which are vulnerable to different types of climate change. So there's some stuff there to work with, but I wonder who are working to bring all this together in order to enable countries and the UNFCCC actually to bring these kind of input from countries on the same footing.
Thank you. Excellent question. I think you're highlighting a number of different elements there. One is that there is probably a number of sort of process indicators about what makes for a good adaptation process. And then there's outcome or output indicators in terms of what you then actually do. I think a key question also, if you look at using SDG indicators, is whether we'd be using SDG indicators from the climate SDG, or actually whether we're looking at climate resilience of all of the SDGs, including the ones more related to health or food or you name it. And in fact, you might find some of your process indicators around good decision making and governance in some of the other SDGs as well. Anyone from the panel with thoughts on that? Sven.
Yeah, thank you. It's not an easy question, but I try to give some thoughts to it. I mean, just the fact that these discussions are becoming more serious, parties start to think more, okay, we have this global goal on adaptation, we know we agreed on something, but how do we get to it, and these submissions, etc. I think these are all elements which reflect that there's a search going on in a way. Of course, not a search from scratch, but based on a lot of development experience and so on, and also increasing adaptation experience. But I think we have a momentum here for the next 1 or 2 years where this needs to be, I mean, I wouldn't say nailed, but where we need to make real progress on this. And of course, this is not only a task for the Adaptation Committee, but basically, in a way, everyone in this broader community who is working with governments and trying to help them build resilience and measure it in a broader sense. So not only, I think we need to find ways that it's not only, let's say, the adaptation progress measurement in a very narrow sense, but more broadly on everything that's related to climate impact. So I think we all need to spread the word also that these discussions are happening, and there's increasing attention from governments, country groups, etc., and need to find ways to, I mean, on the one hand, also test things out, I think, but use opportunities such as the Adaptation Committee expert meeting, which I mentioned, which is scheduled sometime next year, to feed experience into this. There's also going to be a process under the UNFCCC in terms of some sort of review of the national adaptation plans progress. I think there's a deadline for submission sometime in October. So next year there will be a bigger chance to analyze where do we stand in terms of the NAPS process. I hope many countries try to gather the experiences and what are the gaps, but also what are the good examples to take that forward. So I think we need to see all of these as elements in the bigger picture, and which can then also hopefully drive up some of the ambitions that we need also on the adaptation side.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer the question, but just to reflect a little bit. The negotiations with regards to adaptation communication is moving in a direction where we will have to, at some point, deal with quantifying these elements, which we did really thought they were qualitative, they were not quantitative. I mean, those of us who work in resilience and adaptation, we know many of these things we cannot really quantify. But this is what the adaptation communication will eventually mean, that we have to quantify certain things in order for us to measure progress, because otherwise, if in a qualitative manner, it's not going to be easy, especially that we have to do this global stocktake. So the Africa group did submit a few elements, and we've done a bit of work. We're still struggling with that, because adaptation it's not something that you can easily do that. That's why we are proposing elements such as what is the percentage of people that are vulnerable to, that are exposed, coastal area, percentage. So all sorts of things, the percentage of people that are vulnerable to certain things, to certain risks. So it's not an easy conversation, and I think I'd like to agree with you that this is something that we should, get conversations like this with non-state actors and academics to help us think through what this means, because it might go through a very academic exercise, which is also quite political at the end of the day. And I mean, if you look at what is the conversation that's taking place right now under the AC and LEG around adequacy of adaptation and effectiveness of adaptation. In the academic world, you can write this around what exactly is effective adaptation, yet we're supposed to actually measure that. So that's the difficulty that we're going to face in the negotiations, because we are going into an area where we have to quantify things that in the past were never quantifiable.
No, I very much agree with what both of you said, and I think it would be really great, building on what you just said, Kulthoum, if we could, one way forward would be to establish a process that would build on the experiences from the Sendai framework and maybe from the SDGs as well, where you could really provide a forum that could bring together both people who are under the negotiations and everybody outside of that to come together and discuss and share their experiences and their learnings on how can you actually I think it needs to be a combination, not only quantitative indicators, which are really difficult, but also qualitative. And you need that sort of different types of information to really give a good picture of whether progress is being made or not. And then I think one of the greatest challenges is to move, as you also mentioned, from basically becoming better and better at tracking input indicators or process or monitoring stuff, and then towards actually measuring effectiveness and efficiency, which is extremely difficult and which we're not able to do yet. So those are some of the major challenges that can not only be addressed under the negotiations, but definitely has to involve everybody working on these issues.
We're nearing the end of our time. Did you have any final words to add? Anyone from the audience? We've come full circle on many of these topics. Clearly not a topic that we would resolve, even with a small group, much more manageable than 190 countries in a room. But I think we've identified some common elements and some challenges for these different processes to resolve over these coming years. I guess the first critical moment where we need to have some coherence on this, the facilitated dialogue, but then got a bit more time for the global stocktake. We had very similar discussions, I can tell you, by the way, last week at the scoping meeting for the IPCC 6th assessment report, which is also looking at how to collate the scientific evidence in a way that makes sense from a perspective of our real understanding, the quality of what's in the scientific literature, but also what's policy relevant for the decision makers. And many common elements. I think one is this issue of scale. I think that's something that Secretary de Guzman already started with. The challenges of capacity, especially at the lower scales, as a key ingredient for the ability to not only measure progress, but actually make progress. So how do you also incorporate those capacity constraints into your adaptation planning? How do you address them effectively? How do you measure your progress on that capacity? A focus on the most vulnerable. I think it was also very telling, your response to the question, how can we better involve the private sector? I always like to say that smallholder farmers, the most vulnerable, are actually also private sector. So it's a different way of thinking. But then also from the BSR perspective, the notion that might require a focus on risk and risk management as a more central concept. Interestingly, the IPCC is also moving in that direction. So while adaptation is a good framing of what needs to be done from a perspective of the convention and from a financing perspective, if you look at what decision makers on the ground are often interested in, is the risks they face today, and then to some extent the way they're changing, and what are the most effective and efficient measures indeed to better manage that risk. So maybe it's also a matter of aligning the language we use here to frame adaptation with language that works for private sector operators and that works in the context of the SDGs. And then we may indeed, as you so eloquently said, also be able to pick up quite a lot of the existing indicators and existing tracking systems and get a bigger buy-in also from a much wider community at all scales, other sectors than just the climate agencies and environment ministries that often come to these rooms to negotiate, but especially all these other stakeholders. So I'll leave it there. On behalf of UNEP and the FAO, the host of the Secretariat of this A2R initiative, and the International Federation of the Red Cross as the co-sponsors to this side event, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. We had an online presence as well. I think we had 4 viewers at some point, so I think everyone's been busy on a Friday evening. But it might also still be available in case you've been inspired by this discussion and want to share it with your friends. With that, I wish you a great continuation of your Friday evening, and I'm sure we'll talk again. Several of these forums have been mentioned. Let's all leave this room with an intention to continue this discussion and bring more people into it when we reconvene further. Thank you very much, and good night.
Oh, did you?
I'm interested to talk a bit longer at some point about any adaptation gap reports.
Yeah, so am I.
Start?
I'm not on the microphone because that's for media.
I don't
Okay,